Something happened starting in the 1950s that initially promised jobs and economic stimulation for U.S. cities like Rochester. But these promises weren't without their share of downsides. The interstate boom of the latter half of the 20th century had a dark side still being felt in cities today. Close-knit communities in some urban areas were divided, wounded, and in a number of cases destroyed. Understanding how this happened, the local impact, and current efforts to fix the damage done is the focus of Reconnect Rochester's upcoming Raise Rise event. Joining me at the desk to explain why this matters to all of us are the panelists for Raise Rise, taking place on Wednesday, September 26th. The Reverend Judy Lee Hay, a Swillburg resident and former pastor of Calvary St. Andrew's Presbyterian Parish. Howard Decker, an architect, urbanist, and author who serves on the board for Reconnect Rochester. And Christine Radarski, city historian for the city of Rochester. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So just to begin, I want to dig into how infrastructure, right, how the building of roadways and highways and bridges has the ability at times to create barriers. Because I would imagine some people are watching this and they would think, how can something like that, it seems counterintuitive of connecting different places, that it can actually create a divide? And Howard, I'll give this to you first. How does it happen?
It happens in Rochester, and it happens in cities all over the world. It came at a time when we felt that our convenience was more important than the fabric of our cities. And finally, at the beginning of the 21st century, we're beginning to rebalance that thinking. But a sense of convenience meant being able to get through a city rather than to a city. And we were zooming from where we live to usually to our suburbs, through our cities on roadways that we built in every city in the United States and all over the world. One of the effects of this was to divide people from one another and to interrupt the fabric of our cities. And we see that in Rochester as we filled in the inner loop on its east side, and now as we consider filling in further portions of the loop, we see that we can knit the city back together again. And that means putting the city back together racially, economically, physically, from all different perspectives, which is so critical. And it's not just Rochester who's giving consideration to these kinds of repairs, finally and thankfully. One of the points, I think, of these films is to show our viewers that this is happening in Rochester, importantly, but it's happening in other places as well. And it kind of records what people are saying and thinking about how to rebalance this kind of critical equation in the physical character of our cities. And you reference the films, and for this event taking place on the 26th, those who attend will get to see a number of documentaries focused on this very issue. When we go back to kind of the latter half of the 20th century, when this happened, I want to ask you, what factors, do we know the types of factors that went into the decision behind building highways and freeways through cities? You said these went straight through. How were these types of things decided? And I'll open that up to anybody.
Economics. I mean, you know, since 1956, when the federal government began to put lots of money for roadways, the most cost-effective way, engineers have said, you go through low-income, predominantly people of color neighborhoods that absolutely drive. So it was economic and racial. I mean, and Swillburg was a great example of that. You know, a low-income neighborhood in Rochester, and they proposed to put it right through the heart of Swillburg, and the state began to build, you know, took 220 parcels of land between Brighton and the city of Rochester. They bought it up for the state to begin to put the highway through, and then displaced 265 families. So I think racial and economic divided the neighborhoods. Let's go into the Swillburg, because that was a story that intrigued me. I learned about that when I first heard about this event. I did not know the Swillburg story. So this is a neighborhood in the late 60s and early to mid 70s that worked to prevent this expressway from going and running through its streets. And we do have a clip of the film, Swillburg documentary. Let's take a little bit of a look at that, just so our viewers can have some background.
In the 1960s, the Department of Transportation's overall plan for expressways included a spur running from the outer loop to downtown. For the Swillburg neighborhood, the highway would cut right through it and destroy it. the state bought up about 220 pieces of property and relocated 265 families in Rochester and Brighton in preparation for the expressway.
Some people panicked. They were very nervous about the road coming through, what it would do to their property value.
In 1971, a task force was appointed and a freeze halted further state acquisition of property. In 1973, the task force recommended not building the expressway, and a month later, City Council voted to stop the expressway. Otto Henderberg Park was dedicated soon after the expressway vote, and the outer loop was completed as a T, with no exits for Clinton Avenue.
Judy, when I watched this entire piece, the narrator explained how even though the expressway was totally blocked, the simple idea of it created damage and that a lot of work had to be done to rebuild this neighborhood. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think two pieces. One, it was a major coalition of groups that helped prevent it. It was obviously neighbors knocking on the doors of Swilberg. It was Ecotran that really was an environmental group that partnered with the Sierra Club, the Southeast Area Coalition. So that was the social kind of network. And then there was the political component of the city council members who really stood up against this. So that was, but all during that time leading up to that, people said, why should I invest in my property if this is really coming through? So you saw the abandonment happen both in Swilberg of houses that deteriorated, but also as you went over to the South Wedge, 120 vacant and boarded houses by 1973 there. So it was that whole southeast section that began the ripple effect.
Let's talk about also just the inner loop. When I think about this and the effects of the interstate boom, my mind immediately goes to the inner loop. And I want to ask you, Christine, in what ways was the inner loop intended to serve the city?
Well, it's really interesting because the inner loop, I don't think, was intended to serve city residents. It was intended to serve the business district and city businesses. So the whole point behind the inner loop, the people would talk about creating a business district, not a traffic district, because the automobiles were becoming increasingly popular. Many of the residents were moving out to the suburbs, and there was a desire among business leaders to get people from the suburbs back into the city to do business in the city. So the idea was to create this conduit that connected the city to the suburbs. But the work that was done really took into account the businesses and the people living in the cities, and not so much the residents within the city itself. So you know, the impact upon the residents ended up being very great. And as we've talked about, neighborhoods were cut in half. And it affected, as we noted, people of low income. It also affected historic districts. Look at the Third Ward. This is the Cornhill, the place where Rochester was founded. And we lost, you know, so many important buildings that today would have been designated landmarks. Lewis Henry Morgan, we're celebrating Lewis Henry Morgan this year, the father of anthropology. His house was one of the ones in the Third Ward that was destroyed. In the other part of the city, we have John Jacob Bausch's house that was destroyed. We had factories, people displaced in a number of neighborhoods. Now, and I will point out that Cornhill at this point in time was largely an African-American neighborhood. So it has this rich history that's associated with the white founding of our city, but by this point in time it was, you know, a large percentage African-American.
And I think it's interesting that the inner loop came at a time when the whole way in which we lived, where we worked, where we shopped, was shifting. And this was in the 50s when the planning was underway, and then into the early 60s when the construction began. And I think a lot of the powers of the corporate and commercial districts were trying to build a loop which would bring people to the downtown, even though by then the shift had already taken place and everyone was going out to the suburbs. So it was a kind of misplaced thinking that this roadway would solve something, and it didn't solve it at all, of course. It made extraordinary damage. And there were a lot of people then, as Christine is pointing out, who fought very hard to keep it from happening. I think of Billy Harrington, who was then head of the Landmark Society, fighting so hard to keep the roadway out of the Third Ward unsuccessfully. And when we lived in Washington, I remember so vividly learning of a movement to put an expressway through neighborhoods there in Washington, D.C., and the protesters carried big signs that said, "White man's roads through black men's homes." And so the racial dimension of this is very difficult to underestimate. It was a very significant part of the planning and thinking, in that those who had the least amount of political power and had the least amount of sway were the ones who were the most victimized by the location of these roadways.
Well, and I think that is the racial component, that the whites made the decision and the power to go through low-income neighborhoods to save money. But what happened is that all these African-American wonderful communities that were rich in music and business and social networking literally were divided apart. And you see over time, whether it's in Boston or New York or Chicago, the deterioration that happened in the businesses being lost and people being moved out. I mean, that's that whole urban removal, in essence, not renewal, but removal. That's the racial component. And I think that's part of our hard legacy in this highway building to get faster, but deteriorating neighborhoods as a result of it.
Well, and the legacy exists not just on the landscape, but in the social constructs within the city. You know, many of these people were relocated. They were given fair market value for their housing, but they weren't given assistance to relocate. So no assistance in finding new places to live, no assistance in moving. So were there people who might have had their home purchased, but they literally couldn't afford to pack up their belongings and go. So it had real economic implications too.
Well, there are you mentioned this, highway removal projects are taking place around the country right now due to this disruption of these highways and roadways and what they've caused. We look at Rochester, we've got the Interloop East project, which is incorporated in a new Rochester Street film that we'll get to see at the event on the 26th. And we do have a short clip of the trailer that I'd like for viewers to take a look at.
Simple but powerful quote from Fred Kent of Project for Public Spaces is that if you plan cities for cars and traffic, you'll get cars and traffic. If you plan cities for people and places, you'll get people and places. There's no question that we disrupted communities, and so while we made the city more accessible to people coming in from outside, coming and going, we harmed the people that were here. It's no surprise that as we're fixing some of these mistakes from the sort of automotive urban renewal era, it also is at a time where the city is truly coming back to life. We're seeing the mistakes that we made and we're taking steps to correct them. This project is a great example of that.
As we look at the Interloop East project, if I can say that correctly, what do you think is most promising about this project for Rochester?
The streets are reconnected. The fabric of the city is knitted back together again. We have a continuous set of buildings which lead us from one side to the other. We can walk across that roadway now easily and often. We can ride across it on our bikes. The city is essentially being put back together again. And now we can only hope that this process will continue all the way around, because it's time.
There's been much talk, I should say, of an infusion of funding when it comes to infrastructure in our nation. And as we really wait to learn more details of the president's agenda, what do we need to ask ourselves in terms of what's happened in the past so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past as we look to the infrastructure plans moving forward, not just in Rochester, but nationwide?
Well, I think it's part of what we're talking about in the city as a walkable community, where you can ride your bike, you can walk, you can have access where you're not just zooming past in a car, but that knitting the neighborhood, as Howard said, is such an important piece of rebuilding the understanding of community and the social value of relationships that happen when you're in close proximity as opposed to something dividing you.
I think that we finally are beginning to ask ourselves this question, who are cities for and what our cities should be like? We're beginning to ask ourselves this question in a slightly different way than we did 50 years ago. And it's allowing us to rebalance things and say to ourselves, maybe we need the walkable, diverse, mixed-use kind of place that, for example, Rochester used to be, but many communities used to be. And so this whole rebalancing has always been a part of the dynamic of making cities, and we should all be grateful to know that we're beginning, at last, we're beginning to think again about the value of things like highways through our city.
Yeah. And as we'll see in some of these films, in other communities where this has already happened, we've seen economic revitalization and, you know, a social atmosphere growing. So I think it's really, it gives us something to look forward to.
Absolutely.
And oh, go ahead, Judy.
Well, I'm going to say, and I think that's the other piece is rediscovering the artists. There are lots of examples in some of the films where artists are now reclaiming some of the areas that were underneath the expressways, and the revitalization of that kind of creative spirit where they're claiming, okay, you know, yes, you tried to destroy our neighborhood, but we're coming back to say this is our neighborhood. And so the rediscovery of art in the place of creativity and community building.
All right, well, we are out of time, but a special thank you to my guests for joining me today. You have the opportunity to learn more about the upcoming Reconnect Rochester and Rochester Street Films event, Raise Rise. So save the date for this event. It is Wednesday, September 26th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at the Cinema Theater. As you heard, there will be a number of short film screenings followed by a discussion with my guests here today and Dr. Marvin McMickle, President and Director of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, who wanted to be here today but is out of town.